Welcome everyone to our first working group meeting on renewable and biomass energy. Thanks for joining. It should be a pretty quick session today. We're just trying to get to know each other and see which solutions we'll be working on over the course of this fellowship, and just get to know what other solutions are in the working group kind of at large, and how we can share resources, and also just look at that solution list and see if there's any changes we might want to explore. So I'll kick it off by just talking a little bit about why we created these working groups. The idea is to really facilitate dialogue between fellows, and then also mentors will be coming in at times, and our senior fellows. So it's about sharing information, bouncing ideas off of one another, discussing things like the interaction effects, and starting to plan for that integration phase, and also just sharing resources in terms of data sets and helpful reports. So the mentors are people who will be doing lunch and learns with us. There's lunch and learns every other week. They're industry and academic experts. And they've offered to, give some of their time to help the fellows and help our research process, and pointing people in the right directions of meta-analyses or other experts. And as these working groups progress, we'll be updating one another with what our research has been. So it'll be some really interesting, surprising discoveries that people have come up with will be shared during these working groups. I think they'll be a really fun and exciting time. And I think that is about it. Oh yeah, the last thing is the spring fellows that were part of these working groups for the first cohort will be joining in and sharing their results from their research and anything that they found super helpful during that time. So that's kind of a overview of what we're doing here. And today we'll just be going around and hearing what solutions people are working on and what their experience is with those solutions in the past. And then we'll have a quick discussion about kind of how they overlap and how we might start to think about shared resources, interaction effects, addressable markets, and some assumptions that we might all share. And because no one has gotten too deep into their research yet, that discussion will probably be pretty short today. And then we'll go through the list and talk about that and any additions or changes or ideas that people have. Welcome, Raihan. Thanks for joining.
Yes, thank you.
Excellent. So if we just could go around and hear from folks on what they're researching and what experience they have with that solution or something similar to it that they're bringing to the table. So I think we'll just go in the order along the bottom, or at least in the order I see, which is Amresh, Dr. Karan, George, Karan, and then Raihan. So Amresh, if you could kick us off.
Hello, am I audible?
We can hear you.
Okay, so cogeneration and biomass-based gasification. So, currently I am involved in with an organization called Emergence Bioenergy, and we are setting up a microgrid plant in rural Bihar, which is using Stirling engine to produce electricity. So this particular engine uses cogeneration and uses both combined heat and power effectively. So in terms of like technical understanding, there's not much inside it. So that is one of the reason I took up this particular solution, so that I can learn more about it. But yeah, so more into the implementation side, I have some understanding about cogeneration, that how it the usage of how it reduces the wastage of electricity, and how both heat and power and electricity can be used at the same time, and uh, mostly an efficiency. Also, like with regards to my second solution, which is biomass based gasification. So yes, this particular engine uses a different biomass based source, like husk power, uh, cow dung, poultry dung. So all these are used in a biomass digester to generate electricity. So that is how I am like related to these solutions, and I hope to like learn more on these two solutions and get the theoretical base much more strong. So since like currently I am practicing it in a practical scenario, so I wanted to make my theoretical understanding about these solutions much more stronger, and much more I wanted to have a deep ground study about all these solutions.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing. I'm looking forward to learning more about both of those from you. Excellent. Dr. Karan, if you could take it next.
Hi. Yeah. I had a master's in renewable energy, and I worked as a research associate where I worked on mini grids. So the solutions which I've been assigned are mini grids and solar air heat pumps. So I've got pretty good experience on mini grids because I worked on a project called Oasis South Asia, that's off-grid energy access. Where I worked on load estimation, resource assessment, designing customized solutions for remote regions in India. And other than that, I was also a co-founder of an energy startup company where it's a 2-year-old startup, and we've already installed 1 megawatt of rooftop solar for the Indian Railways. So yeah, I think that would be, I guess, would add some experience on solar, but on solar air heat pumps particularly, it's an upcoming technology, but I'm sure down the line I would gain some hands-on on that as well, which I could contribute to this project.
Excellent. Thank you. All right, George, let's hear from you.
I'm doing wind energy, micro wind turbines, and wave and tidal energy. My graduate thesis was on wind energy out in Wyoming, so I'm pretty well versed in that regard. And then wave and tidal energy is it's pretty similar. I mean, the air is a fluid and water is a fluid, so the same principles apply. But I'm definitely eager to learn more about the wave and tidal aspect of it. Yeah, that's about it. I mean, Wyoming's the windiest spot in the lower 48 states in the United States, so it's pretty interesting. My thesis was from an atmospheric science perspective and less from an engineering perspective. So it'll be interesting to see how my research kind of correlates with what Drawdown is doing.
Mm-hmm. And you did some research on fluid dynamics, right? Or it was something with dishwashers and efficiency?
That was in undergraduate school. Yeah, I worked in Illinois Toolworks, which is a big company that makes a bazillion things, and one of the projects I worked on was on commercial dishwashers. So we were looking at improving the efficiency of those things by looking at how the sound impacts the stuff inside the dishwasher, and I designed some algorithm that listened to the sounds of the water ricocheting off everything and was able to determine what was being washed. But I don't know how much that will apply to what Drawdown is doing. It was just kind of an engineering thing I did.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, George. AG.
Hey everybody. So I'm working on bioenergy. To be completely honest, I don't yet have a background in it, but for my master's project, I'm going to be doing a risk assessment for investment in woody biomass in the U.S., which kind of sits at the intersection of my dual degrees of environmental management with a focus in energy and forestry. So yeah, that pretty much covers it. I've done various work in renewables before, but not so much in bioenergy. And actually, one thing while I've got everybody here on the call is I was hoping to get a little bit of clarification on what exactly I should be including in the field of bioenergy, because I can see we've got people working on biofuels, methane digesters, and waste energy. So I'm kind of wondering if I'm looking exclusively at electricity generation, if I'm including transportation fuels in there, if I'm going to be looking at biogas and syngas, or if I'm just looking at direct combustion of biomass for the purposes of electricity generation.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's kind of exactly what these working groups are intended to do is find that clarification. I think biomass energy is one of the solutions that it's almost an umbrella of a lot of other solutions, and so it will kind of encompass the other ones, and you'll kind of be paying attention to those other analyses, but also will catch anything that isn't included in those other ones. So let's map that out when we're looking at the solutions in just a little bit.
Great.
And see how that works. Yeah.
Sounds good.
Great. Raihan?
Yes. So good morning to all of you. Although it is at 11:22 at night. Okay. So
it's almost morning there again.
Yes, I am serving as an environmental specialist at Infrastructure Development Company Limited, and it is basically well known for financing in renewable energy projects as well as large infrastructure projects. From in abbreviated terms, we call it IDCOL, Infrastructure Development Company Limited, and we call it IDCOL. From IDCOL, we have already financed around 4 million solar home systems in the off-grid areas of Bangladesh, and we have already financed around 40,000 biogas plants, and by 2017 we are in the process to install around 1 million improved clean cook stoves throughout the country. So I think that the Drawdown initiative will be quite useful for me to explore the technology of clean cook stoves, because you know that there is not that much technical orientation or technical knowledge base available in regard of clean cook stoves. We have sufficient expertise in case of solar home system, in case of mini grid, but in case of clean cook, it is not that much comprehensive, I could say. So the opportunity of having this fellowship in clean cook stoves assignments will definitely be a great opportunity for personally for me as well as Bangladesh as well, to promote the clean cook concept as well as project in a more comprehensive and effective manner. And other than the financing, IDCOL also provides technical consultancy service in some African countries. So we will also be able to disseminate this learning to these African countries like Ethiopia, Uganda, Zambia. So definitely this learning will be very effective throughout the globe, and I believe that definitely we will be able to come to an effective output. So that's all from me.
Great, thanks, thanks, Raihan. If I can just jump in for a second. What's also a good thing to point out is many of you have experience in things in microgrids, in bioenergy, in biomass gasification, so on. So you have a lot of overlap between you. So you've been assigned the solutions independently, but because this particular group has such an overlap of experience with the different different solutions. We can really start to lean on each other to help formulate the research and sort of point us in the right direction and create data sets that are going to be applicable to all of these different solutions, or at least point us in the right direction. So we're actually, I think, quite lucky with this group to have brought this, collection of skills together.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely, I'm feeling lucky.
For you and for Amresh and for the entire group, there's a lot of crossover.
Okay.
And then it'd be great to hear from you, Kevin and Zeke, about what renewable energy or biomass energy solutions that you've worked on, in preparing the model, and then in last cohort, just kind of give the group a sense of some of the other solutions that have already been completed.
Sure, I can talk a little bit to that.
Excellent, thanks, Zeke.
So one of the things we originally built the model using was solar PV, just because it's such a iconic technology, and in many ways it's something of an easy technology because there's less moving parts than some other things, so to speak. We've also done a fair bit of work with the last cohort on a number of different technologies, including things like wind energy, both onshore and offshore, geothermal, and a few other technologies that Kevin might remember off the top of his head that I'm slightly blanking on. But generally, we try to build the best models we can for these, and a lot of the energy technologies are very similar in the way they're modeled. A good chunk of them are reducing or offsetting electricity that would otherwise be produced by fossil fuels. And we've already done a fair bit of groundwork as far as putting together estimates of future grid emission factors by region in a business as usual scenario, so you can sort of have a baseline to subtract the energy produced by a renewable source from, as well as converting that into CO2 and methane, and doing the calculations for atmospheric parts per million for those. Kevin, you have some stuff on that?
Only thing to add is in the spring fellowship there was a fellow working on waste to energy, and
methane digesters.
And methane digesters, yeah.
Yeah,
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. That's all I'd add.
Yeah. And Zeke, you've worked on concentrated solar.
Yep, I've also worked on concentrated solar power, which is the sort of flip side of solar PV.
Mm-hmm.
In
fact, we also have an additional fellow who's worked on in-stream hydro.
One other thing to add in, Chad, would be that the fellow who worked on district heating and cooling created the assumption that the energy source, it would be cogen, in that biomass energy was modeled as the archetype for the district heating and cooling methodology. So there's a data set there that could be useful for some of the fellows or looking at potential overlaps.
Mm-hmm. Great. That's true.
Excellent. This is exactly what these working groups are designed to do: is discover data sets and resources that we can all share and utilize.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. KG, I will make sure you have access to that. So this conversation will go on longer for future working group meetings, but I'd love to hear just a little discussion about how we think these solutions might overlap and how we might want to work together on coming up with assumptions or looking at addressable markets, and if there's any other ideas of shared resources or data sets that come to mind, at this early stage. I just want to give room for that.
Sure. I can start by discussing sort of what we've already done around those things and give a few resources we've put together. So one of the challenges, as everyone's probably aware with this effort, is that these technologies don't exist in a vacuum. We're trying to consider 100 different technologies, and a lot of them interact with each other in ways that are important to try to characterize. Now, we can't necessarily model all these interactions before we do an initial sort of first run at each technology, just because we're not sure what the impacts of other things are going to be. But we want to make sure that when we're modeling, we're being very conscious that other things are going to affect this, and we want to create our models such that it's relatively easy to tweak various inputs, like, say, future population growth or future energy demand or underlying business as usual grid mixes, so that if other technologies affect those things, we can sort of model their effects into our technology that we're looking at relatively easily. And so we'll be sending you the model we've created shortly, and we'll have a session to go over that, and we'll explain exactly where all those things are in the model and how to change them. In terms of shared resources, though, there's a number of different data sets that are up on Trello, which I think people have access to already, but if not, they'll be there shortly, around data sets for folks to use. So we've been leaning fairly heavily on a lot of the energy modeling work done for the third assessment report, the third working group of the fifth assessment report of the IPCC. So the IPCC report that came out the year before last, or last year, I guess, the working group 3 came out. And so on Trello, there's information on how to access the AR5 scenario database. Specifically, we've been using for a lot of things a model called Message, which is a model that's been put together by the folks at YASA, which is an international energy group. And so they have model runs from the Message model for different scenarios, like a business as usual scenario, for 50 parts per million scenario, that include future energy mixes by region. So globally, and US, China, EU, Asia, things like that. And so that ends up being quite useful for our purposes. And then other data sets that are useful, we have access to a IEA report on sort of pathways to get to 2C. They also have 4C and 6C pathways that has some useful future energy modeling things. And there's a number of other data sources that will all be up on Trello that will be useful for folks, particularly around the assumptions associated with adoption of your technology. So how much solar will there be in the future, that sort of thing.
Great, thanks, Zeke. I was wondering if we might take a moment, and actually, Zeke, I'd love it if you could take over here, to explain to the fellows the concept of units of adoption and operating units of measure, and the total addressable market. These sort of concepts that they're going to have to figure out for their solutions for next week as they talk with you in the mandatory office hours. And if you could maybe just discuss what these concepts are in the context of renewable energy and biomass energy, if you can.
Sure. And Kevin might want to fill in on parts of this, because
absolutely, the two of you.
Stuff that's relevant to the financials that I might not have on the top of my head. But generally speaking, one of the most challenging parts of this whole project is to figure out an optimistically plausible, as we call it, adoption scenario for your technology, which essentially is saying, in a world where, a lot of things went right, and there's a big push for this technology, what is the sort of optimistically plausible scenario for how much could be adopted in the future? And when possible, we want to sort of take these sort of numbers from existing published sources, or at least do reasonable extrapolations from existing published sources. And in terms of units of adoption, there's a few different things to consider, particularly for energy sources. So in a lot of cases, you'll be looking at two things. One is the kilowatt hour or terawatt hour or some integrated unit of generation. Both globally. So what is global electricity demand going to be in the future for the whole world? And we have some scenarios for that you can use. And what % of that is your technology going to make up? And those numbers are important for calculating. So the kilowatt-hour production is important for calculating things like the dollar savings associated with the technology. So how much does a kilowatt-hour of solar cost versus a kilowatt-hour of conventional generation, for example, and how does that change over time? It's important for calculating carbon, of course, because you usually have some sort of emission factor per kilowatt-hour for carbon calculations. But the other thing that's important to consider for renewable energy is, and energy in general, is capacity. So a lot of things are, particularly around costs, the installation cost of a technology is not generally on a per kilowatt-hour basis, it's on a per kilowatt of installed capacity basis. So a kilowatt of solar costs this much. Similarly, indirect emissions associated with these technologies, so the emissions required to manufacture, to produce, to install, to transport, all those fun things, also tend to be better expressed in a per kilowatt basis. And so in a lot of cases, and when we're going through the model, we'll show some examples of this. You need to sort of mix and match between capacity and generation for calculating different numbers. And you need some sort of capacity factor assumption to translate between the two. And those all are pretty easy to find in the literature around your specific technology or measure. Kevin, do you have any thoughts on specifics around adoption that are relevant for financials that I didn't cover?
No, I think that does cover it pretty well. The only thing, depending if your technology, I think that actually covers it. It's just watch for, there's definitely almost always going to be a distinction between that unit of adoption and then the operating unit of measure, which goes into the operating cost. And your technology may have other costs around maintenance, equipment maintenance, and so forth. And one of the opportunities or challenges is then to convert those into the standardized operating unit of measure. So if your operating unit of measure is kilowatt hours, but there's a X number of dollars that are spent to maintain a certain amount of equipment, and you find the figures either in dollars per kilowatt of installed energy or dollars in terms of some unit of adoption measure, then it's incumbent upon you to factor that figure to make it the operating unit of measure, and that can be a little bit tricky sometimes. And we'll show you some examples in the models.
Excellent. Do any of the fellows have any questions about that or want clarification on anything that was just shared?
Can I just jump in for a second? I had to walk off for a second. Kevin or Zeke, did you discuss the total addressable market?
Yes.
Okay, great.
For most energy technologies, the total addressable market is simply the total future global energy demand. And as I mentioned, we have some data sets that we've already put together for that you can use from the working group 3 models that I was discussing earlier. And a lot of this in general will be a little bit clearer once we've had time to actually walk through the model framework. But
yeah, certainly when we get to that session, it will be much more clear. But I want them to get a sense of what they should be looking out for in the literature in the next few days as they prepare. Okay, Amanda, are you back on?
Yes, I'm back.
Okay, great.
All right. So any other conversation around shared data sets or assumptions that people would like to discuss now? Or just keep that in mind that that's something we'll be talking about at most working group sessions.
Yeah, I think we should just keep in mind that these are going to be talked about quite often in the next couple sessions. Mm-hmm. and of course, they'll be talked about in particular in relation to your specific solution next week when you have your mandatory office hour with one of the senior fellows. And then the week after that, when you have your second mandatory office hours with the fellow to determine your adoption scenarios. Again, this is all will be explained in the modeling session, but just keep it sort of so you're a little bit forewarned. The other thing to consider and to remember when you're doing your research is to always be thinking about potential double counting or interaction effects that may arise from adoption of one of your solutions, and how you might you're not, as I said yesterday, you're not going to necessarily deal with all of those double counting and interaction effects in the modeling or in the research right away, but they are going to be down the line. So always keeping in mind what those double counting and interaction effects could be is really important, and this working group will be a venue for us to sort of discuss that and open how we can deal with that into the future.
Could you give an example of double counting? I'm kind of hazy on that concept. This is George, by the way.
Sure, I can give one really quick. So between energy technologies, it's usually a little bit less relevant, but between energy technologies and other measures, it's a lot more relevant. So for example, if you're modeling solar PV, your future energy demand assumptions have a certain built-in set of assumptions of their own around future population growth. So if another fellow has a measure around improving female literacy and reproductive health access to reduce future population growth, that reduction in future population growth is going to have an impact on future energy demand, which will have an impact on the addressable market for your technology, which will have an impact on the adoption of your technology in the future. Similarly, downstream, there's a lot of interactions. So if another fellow is doing an energy efficiency measure, the carbon reduction from energy efficiency is going to depend on the grid mix. The grid mix is going to depend on the specific adoption of different technologies that fellows are looking at. So all these things are sort of tied together. And even between energy technologies, we want to make sure that the adoption scenarios are not, you don't add up to more than 100% of global energy demand, and that you're not finding or using very different models that have very different assumptions around future adoption.
Okay, thanks. That helps.
All right, any other questions? We can move on to the solutions if not. So just quickly before we go, I've pasted, and I kind of pasted twice. The ones on the bottom are the biomass ones again, but you'll see a list of the solutions there that are included in this working group. And we've been working for several years on amassing this list, but it's by no means set in stone. So I'd like everyone to just take a look at that list and come back next session, which will be the 16th, I believe, or June 15th at 10 a.m. Pacific time, and come back with any reflections on what might be missing or what you think might work better bundled together. We'd love to have more input on this list, especially from people with experience like yours. And then KG, Chad and I will have a chat with you about biomass specifically, because the more I look at it, the more there's a lot of overlap with district heating and cogen and everything. Yeah, let's stay online. Great idea. Excellent. Well, thanks everyone for a great kickoff meeting. Great to know kind of who's in our group and what we'll be working on, and it was really helpful to hear from you, Kevin and Zeke, about what resources are out there and how to move forward. So thanks for joining everyone, and we'll talk to you soon.
Great, thank you.